Greetings, friends. You are on the Military Reports channel. And today we will discuss with you the situation in Ukraine on the 12th of June, 2024 year. A lot of things have happened today, so let's get started. And we will start with you with a missile strike, with a massive missile strike, with a massive strike on the territory of Ukraine by drones. That took place last night. In these frames, on this map, for example, we can observe with you the main routes of strikes. Apparently with you, that basically all the goals fell on the settlement of Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. But there are a couple of points that are worth paying attention to. Let's say you should pay attention to the green strip running from the Crimean Peninsula to Odessa. According to Ukrainian sources, it was also an Iskander-M missile, and this is the only missile that the Ukrainian armed forces and the Ukrainian air defense forces failed to shoot down last night. Everything else, without exception, was shot down by the air defense of Ukraine, according to their information. Down for Ha-100 and 1 Ha-5555 missiles, 1 Dagger, and 24 Shahed-type drones. However, during the night and the morning, a large number of shots of the fire were published and, in general, it is hard to believe that everything was shot down right away. But there are still a few interesting points. As reported, there was a Dagger strike on Kiev. It is still unclear the purpose of this strike, whether it was achieved, whether it was not achieved. And it is also worth paying attention to a small loop here, more precisely on. It can be seen with you that in the area of Poltava, some kind of drone of the Russian aerospace forces was winding up a large number of circles, but most likely conducting some kind of reconnaissance activities. It was very difficult to understand what purpose, what exactly this drone was trying to find. But a little later, Russian sources published a large number of frames, what exactly was there, in which searches the Russian aerospace forces was specifically in. And this information was added to the map. For example, in these frames, we can observe with you how a Russian drone, during reconnaissance activities, revealed a cluster of air defense systems of Ukraine S-300, and this cluster of equipment was struck by Iskander. As a result of the strike, most likely part of the equipment, part of the air defense systems of Ukraine was disabled. In these frames, we see with you the launch of missiles, that is, this is the second secondary detonation after the Iskander strike. That is, there were releases of uncontrolled air defense missiles of Ukraine, and apparently this was the blow. A little to the west in the area of the Mir Award at the airfield, footage was also published of how, during reconnaissance activities, it was possible to detect a cluster parking, let's say, of aviation equipment in the Su-25th, Su-27th, Su-24th groups. And a massive Iskander strike was also inflicted on this cluster of equipment. During the strike, most likely several pieces of equipment were destroyed. In other words, it is now clear more or less what happened that night, what goals were there. But again, it is still not clear where they were stabbed. And if we talk in general about the air defense system of Ukraine, today information has been received from several sources that the United States will soon transfer another Poet air defense system to Ukraine. And we also received the same story from Germany today. The German leadership also promised to provide Ukraine with an air defense system in the near future. However, it should be understood that this is not a new manufactured air defense system. It is an air defense system that currently covers Europe. Let's say a Patriot who is being transferred to the United States is currently in Poland and is covering Poland. In other words, it turns out that for some reason, Western countries are beginning to deploy the air defense system as much as possible on the territory of Ukraine. This is not the last system to be transferred. And the question arises, for what purpose, for what and for what purposes? There is a massive pumping of air defense systems into the issue. I have my own opinion on this. It seems to me, I believe that in the near future foreign contingents, including foreign instructors, will be deployed on the territory of Ukraine and, say, in order to protect them, and reduce the likelihood of losses right on the first day as a result of another Dagger strike. And attempts are being made to deploy the system so that the entry of Western troops takes place as smoothly as possible. Western instructors, primarily French, on the territory of Ukraine. Well, then we are moving with you to the line of combat contact. Let's start with you from the Kharkiv direction, where fierce fighting continues. There is no more information on Deep Lipsy yet. The USU took the unit to regroup, and in order to understand what to do next. But in turn, the Russian units do not stop, and continue their assault actions in the direction of the village of Zelene. This has been repeatedly reported to us by the North Group of troops, its command, over the past few days. And today, we began to receive the first more or less gelacated footage of how the assault on this small settlement is being conducted. The green itself is very small, it is a small farm, there are several more or less large villages behind it. It's not boring. And then towards Kharkiv Veselo. But here on these frames, we see with you how artillery training was conducted, suppression of the firing positions of the armed forces, destruction of closed firing positions, warehouses and so on and other material parts. And after that, the assault actions themselves were conducted. It is not yet clear where exactly the Russian units managed to gain a foothold. The only information we have is that according to the North Group of troops, during the offensive, Russian units managed to gain a foothold along the Murom River. This is the Murom River, along which the village of Zelenaya is located. Well, we will see how the situation develops further, but in general, there are prerequisites that the units of the Russian army have already come close to the settlement itself. In the near future, the assault itself will begin. Then we are moving with you to the Volchansk direction, where fighting also continues in the northern part. And according to incoming information, Russian units continue to storm the aggregate plant, but so far no footage has been published. Artillery strikes and air strikes are being carried out around the aggregate plant, which in turn indirectly confirms the presence of Ukrainian fighters in these areas. And in general, here we see the front is absolutely static. The Russian army is not in a hurry. There is no such thing as trying to storm, so far, to throw an unlimited number of personnel. It is unclear for what tasks, for what purposes. Everything is being done gradually, systematically. Now there is a development, analysis in fact, into details, into pieces of the aggregate plant, and the central Volchanskaya citadel. After these two, let's say, strong points, the movement will begin further. However, we also received very interesting information today that after, say, 5 or 6 days of attempts to counterattack in the USU, in the eastern, northeastern directions, today the Russian army has gone on the offensive again, also in the eastern direction. That is, the APU went on the defensive after unsuccessful attempts, and in the near future, we may also see new personnel, and also new territories under the control of Russian units. In general, as you can see, the situation here remains unchanged. Strikes, artillery strikes, the work of Lancets, the work of drones are being carried out, but without, let's say, active advances on the territory of the Kharkiv direction itself. Then we are moving with you to the North Baku direction, firm where a large number of frames are received. At the moment, if we compare all directions, Kapinskaya is one of the most dynamic, one of the fastest developing directions, where every day new personnel are received about additional, let's say, some kind of promotions of Russian units. Here on these frames, which we have just watched with you, you could see how bridges were destroyed, crossings were destroyed. Here is another bridge was destroyed, another crossing, warehouses are being destroyed. In other words, the maximum Russian aviation, Russian artillery is working on, say, temporary deployment points, warehouses, logistics, and at the same time, the main forces. The main units are currently trying to storm both the settlement of a typical Novoselka, and Russian units are advancing, trying to move along the highway from Orlyanka to Samogoinsk. Let me remind you that just yesterday, we received information from the Ministry of Defense that only a small piece of the area, a small field, was taken under control. Today, shots of the sun striking a little to the west are already being published. In other words, there is a gradual cleanup. And in general, it is extremely inconvenient to defend in USU here because these fields, a large gap, a large distance between Petropavlevsk and Orlyanka. And even from this point of view, it is much more convenient for a Russian unit to defend itself in Orlyanka than even for the same Ukrainians in Petropavlevsk from a further offensive. More or less, the situation for the AFU normalizes and stabilizes only when Russian units reach this red line. Then there will be a more or less short distance from Petropavlevsk, and there will already be an opportunity. There will be an opportunity to repel attacks by Russian units using drones. But if the Russian army reaches this line, then it will be extremely difficult to simply predict and design further progress, since anything can happen. Anything can happen. The distance is too great. Next, we are moving with you to the style of the makeshift pink. Over the past day, we have not received any information from here, nor geolocations. The only thing that place is yesterday's report of the Ministry of Defense on full control over the locality of Bazarevka. Then we are moving with you to the Seversk direction. Active military operations are underway here. Russian units are storming the positions of the armed forces of Ukraine. The loudest news comes from a strong point located in the eastern Verkhnykamiansky. Some pro-Russian cartographers claim that during the offensive operations, this stronghold came under the full control of Russian units. Also, the first shots of the strikes in Bir, by the disembodied already west of the support point, are published, which suggests that the Russian units, without stopping, without going into some kind of expectation for some kind of operational pause, continue to move further in the direction of the settlement itself. After clearing the first lines of defense, there is an extremely high probability that in the near future, Russian units will enter the settlements. The advance will begin along the concrete, which of course will be harder on the one hand. But on the other hand it will also be easier. Then we move with you to the south in the area of the excavation. Today, Ukrainian sources have published footage of drone strikes in Bir on units of the Russian army. And some of the shots were deployed at this point. I remind you that a few days ago, cartographers already reported full control over the data network of the strongholds. But we kept the territory in a gray zone, waiting for some geolocation. And today the first geolocations appeared, so we boldly painted the territory red, which confirms full control over the territory of the Russian army. In other words, we see with you that there is really significant progress. Now, on the whole, it is clear why Ivan Darka and the excavation are so active in the disputed area. Why it is currently a priority goal for Russian units, and if, of course, they reach this boundary, this line, the situation for the APU in Seversk will become extremely, extremely sad. Next, we are moving with you to the watch direction. Over the past day, nothing interesting has happened here either in the Kalinovka area, or in the area of the easternmost clock of the Yar, or in the Citadel area. No frames, no geolocations. Just some kind of peace of mind. Perhaps some additional information will appear in the near future. Much more news these days comes from the Avdiivka direction. Russian units continue their assault operations. Today it is interesting, there are a lot of large number of frames and geolocation. Some cartographers claim that Novo-Alexandrovka is under the full control of Russian units. However, if we talk about geolocations, the first ones were published today, and we have already painted a separate part, that is, in the form of this white cloud that flickers before your eyes. This is the territory, according to some cartographers more or less reliable, which has already passed under the control of Russian units. Of the confirmed geolocated over the past day, we have colored only this part. There were also shots published by the Ukrainian side of the application of strikes in Vey by drones on the advancing Russian units. In other words, these actions took place in this area. Although, despite the fact that some cartographers are already reporting full control, footage of the Krasnopol strike on, let's say, the remaining last extreme positions of the APU in the settlement of Novo-Alexandrovka itself was also published today. This stronghold is located south of the reservoir. In other words, these shots confirm that at least another part of the new Alexandrovka is under the control of the APU. This is an insignificant part, and definitely the overall picture of this situation will not change. Perhaps even the Russian units do not have such plans, they will not even move on. Since in general the flank has already been secured as much as possible. There is an opportunity to move both to Kalinova and further complete the situation in the village of Sokol. Active military operations are underway in Sokol, already on the very western edge of it. Russian units are putting the squeeze on Ukrainian units, forcing them to retreat under heavy artillery and aviation fire. But we will see how long they can resist here. But there is still an opportunity to retreat somewhere. There is still a sunrise behind the Falcon, Evgenyevka. So there's still a lot of work to do. If we talk about the first Novoselovka, then in fact the official storming of this settlement has already begun today. Pro-Ukrainian cartographers report that Russian units already control more than, let's say, 70% of the settlement of Novopokrovskaya. The remaining 20–30% are in the gray zone. In other words, It is also possible to talk with you about the fact that Novoselovka I is already following Novopokrovsky. Here in principle, as if not quite a little bit, a couple of 100 meters there. And already the fighting will begin in the village itself. I also remind you that the assault operations are being conducted from the southern direction. And they are now being conducted from the eastern direction to the district Pokrovsky. In other words, in the coming days, fighting will begin on the streets of Novoselovka first. Which in fact, the entire final stage will already pass to us. Since Novoselovka is the first, this is the final reference point in the direction. All others are secondary. This is a more or less large village, there are some farms, there are some warehouses, and in other words, this is some kind of more or less large settlement. The largest settlement is just west of Avdiivka. We do not take Cheriton's attention, as this is a slightly different tactical zone. Then we are moving with you to the Krasnogorsk direction. Also, footage was published from the AFU of strikes and drones in Beer on units of the Russian army in the settlement of non-troops. And there is also an update of various cartographers. That is, based on all the information about summing up everything, we updated the map again, and now at least 50% of non-troops are under the control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. The remaining farms in the northwestern part are still under control in some. But in the near future, most likely this situation will be resolved, since it is extremely difficult to defend in these fields. And there is too much distance between the nearest settlements of the armed forces of Ukraine and, let's say, it is much easier for Russian units to supply groups and support the offensive than to maintain the defense for high. But all this area is under full and under close supervision and control. Information from the 79th Brigade continues to arrive in the South Donetsk direction. And according to their data, over the past day, Siersky himself came to the direction. However, according to the words of the 79th Brigade, Siersky was not allowed to enter the line of contact. He most likely stayed somewhere in Kurakova, then perhaps even further. I gathered all the generals, gathered all the commanders, all the brigade chiefs, talked with them, talked about what is happening here, what prospects and what to do next. Most likely, he was painted extremely beautiful pictures, and without going to, say, the front, he went on about his business. And in general, it's very frustrating, especially for the 79th Brigade, which is losing its combat, let's say, combat capability every day. And the other day we discussed with you that 235th Battalion was transferred to them as a replenishment. However, after 2 or 3 battles, 2 or 3 or 4 days of fighting with Russian units in the area of Paraskoevka and Konstantinovka, the 235th has worn off as much as possible and at the moment refuses to carry out the orders of the 79th. They have transferred to all orders. And sometimes the whole story comes straight to fights between, say, 235th and 79th Brigades. So far, there is no more news about the successes of, say, the Assault Battalion Askala, which came to replenish the 72nd Brigade. But here, in any case, there will be an advance for sure in the near future, and the APU will continue to retreat. Since in order to stop and stabilize the front line, a normal number of fresh full-blooded brigades need to be transferred here. And without simple half measures, nothing can be solved here. Then we are moving with you to the Zaporozhye work direction. No news. The situation is as stable as possible. We receive a very large number of geolocations from the Kherson direction, to be more precise, from the settlement of Tijinka. Over the past day, about a dozen frames have been published from Kherson. The strikes of the work of drones with Lancets, Lamors, by the armed forces of the Russian Federation. It is still difficult to understand what is the reason for such high activity. It is possible that a part of some units from Kharkov was returned to the Kherson direction, or additional forces were pulled up. It is difficult to say, but in any case, it will become clear in the near future. One of the interesting things that is worth paying attention to is the large number of frames published by the APU of work against Russian reconnaissance drones. At the moment, we all perfectly understand and know that the APU is experiencing big supply problems. There are very big supply problems and, most importantly, big problems with the supply of air defense missiles. Therefore, they probably searched for a long time for a way out, some kind of solution against the Russian drones, and in general, they found some kind of solution. Now all attempts. Today, only 2 videos were published during the day, as Ukrainians with drones tried to knock down Russian drones with a battering ram. In other words, this is some kind of means to save money on air defense missiles. Here on these frames, we watched as a Ukrainian drone rammed down a Russian reconnaissance drone of the Hall. A similar picture also occurred today in the South Donetsk direction, in the area of the village of Rovnopol. We also see with you the flight of a Ukrainian drone, which is catching up with the Russian audience. And the Russian drone was also hit by a battering ram. In other words, it is somehow trying to save missiles, and thereby, in addition, reduce Russian mobility and Russian eyes, as it were. So that there are no, normal intelligence means. Of the interesting things, it is also worth paying attention to the new, let's say, know-how, which is being introduced into a special military operation. For example, firm in the Berdyansk area. Russian units published footage of how they are trying to get the hang of working with amphibious tank. In your eye shots, we see with you a tank that is controlled exclusively by remote method. There is not a single tanker inside, neither a driver, nor a mech warrior, nor, let's say, someone who would load shells. That's all the work being done with a simple drone, with the help of equipment, antennas, and trying to control the tank. That is, it is very interesting for sure that if a special military operation lasts, probably next year, so exactly. No more tankers, as if the profession itself will go into some kind of history, and all tanks will be controlled in this way. In order to save money, and save the lives of personnel in the first place. And it was at the next exhibition that interesting shots of new attack helicopters were also published, which in the near future are also planning to establish, let's say, mass production. These are attack helicopters that are able to carry missiles and hit and destroy, including armored vehicles. Of the interesting things, it is also worth noting from the political news is Pashinyan's statement that Armenia will leave the STO in the near future, but not in the near future, when it is deemed necessary. Of course, this is an interesting statement, and there is quite a lot of conversation about this today. Well, let's see. It is quite possible, because, please note, Armenia has been working for the last few months to transfer all the territories, all the disputed territories between Azerbaijan and Armenia are in favor of Azerbaijan in order, let's say, to resolve all issues under the rules of accession to NATO, the European Union, so that the state of Armenia does not have any territorial claims, and there are no grounds for other states to conduct military actions against this small, let's say, country in the Caucasus. That is, here is such a moment. Today, during the day, Global Hawks, let's say, NATO scouts are flying in the Black Sea in order, let's say, to identify the conduct of reconnaissance activities on the Crimean Peninsula. Today, by the way, is Russia Day. Perhaps some kind of provocation was expected and planned, but something went wrong. Of course, one of the interesting things is also worth noting. This is the arrival of the Russian fleet in Havana to Cuba. A large number of frames are published as the Russian nuclear, let's say, fleet enters the harbor and is greeted by Cubans on board one of these, let's say, Marine ones. There are Zircon missiles on board this fleet, and I remind you that the distance to Miami, to the coast of the eastern United States, is extremely short,